They don't allow our banks. And you know that Canada does not allow banks to go in.
America has grown accustomed to seeing itself as the world's breadbasket. Years of stability, billions of tons of exports, confidence that American grain, soybeans and meat will forever fill the shelves of the world. But today, that confidence is cracking at the seams. What began as a trade strategy has turned into a crisis that is shaking the very foundations of the American economy.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
Amid loud political statements and promises to protect national interests, farmers in the heart of America are experiencing their worst times in decades. Their fields are full of crops, but the elevators are packed to capacity, and no one is coming to buy. Contracts have been terminated, ships are empty, and milk is being poured onto the ground. Billions of dollars are being lost in a matter of weeks. China, until recently the main buyer of American agricultural products, has closed its doors. And it did so not simply out of resentment or emotion, but with cold calculation. In a matter of months, Beijing has rebuilt its entire food supply system. Instead of the United States, there is Brazil, Argentina, and Australia. New ports, new contracts, new alliances.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
In California, warehouses are filled with almonds, in Iowa with soybeans, and in the Midwest, farmers are counting debts they can no longer pay. Across America, family farms that have existed for 3 generations are collapsing. Young farmers are leaving the profession. Older farmers, accustomed to believing in the power of hard work and fair trade, talk about a lost future. Meanwhile, across the ocean, China is strengthening its influence in South America. New railways, modernized ports, investments in energy and mining industries, all this is part of a strategy that is changing the global balance of power. Beijing is not just looking for a replacement for American goods, it is building a new economic system where the US no longer plays the leading role. Economists have warned that trade wars rarely have winners. But now it is becoming clear that the defeat may be much deeper than it seemed. It is not only in lost profits, but also in damage to reputation, loss of trust, and the realization that the world no longer waits for American grain and does not depend on American exports.
So I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
Every day of delay strengthens new ties between China and South America. Every ship leaving the port of Santos for Shanghai is a symbol of a new era in which the United States is losing not just a market, but its historic leadership. What we are seeing today is not just a downturn. It is a shift that could define the future of the global economy for decades to come. America is facing a question that has not been asked since the Great Depression. Can it feed its own farmers? This is a story about politics, money, and how one decision in Washington changed the world map. America has always been proud of its farmers. The people who built the country from the ground up fed not only their own nation, but millions around the world. Their work was considered a symbol of the reliability and strength of the American economy. But today, that symbol is crumbling before our eyes. After the start of the trade war between Washington and Beijing, thousands of farmers across the country found themselves on the brink of survival. When the White House announced the introduction of large-scale tariffs on Chinese goods, few imagined that the retaliatory blow would strike at the heart of American agriculture.
Economic force, because Canada and the United States, that would really be something.
An attack of any sort on this country is an attack on Canada as a member of the NATO alliance.
China's tariffs on American products came as a shock, even to analysts accustomed to tough negotiations. First, Beijing reduced its purchases of soybeans, then followed bans on corn, pork, and dairy products. For farmers in the Midwest, from Minnesota to Kansas, this was a disaster. Soybeans, which a year ago were sold under contract to China, now lie untouched. Elevators are overflowing, grain is stored in the open air, and some farmers, in order to preserve their harvest in some way, have begun to fill old barns and even abandoned warehouses with grain. Photos of these golden mountains of grain have spread across social media, becoming a symbol of the crisis. The federal government has attempted to intervene. The Department of Agriculture has announced an aid program for farmers, but many call it a mere handout. Subsidies cover only part of the losses, and bureaucracy makes it almost impossible to obtain these funds. While officials fill out reports, farmers are losing everything. According to the Soybean Growers Association, losses exceeded $8 billion in the first 6 months after the introduction of Chinese tariffs alone. In some counties, the bankruptcy rate among farmers has risen by 40%. These are not just numbers; behind them are families who have lost their land, their homes, and sometimes their faith in the future.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Against this backdrop of despair, cries of betrayal are growing louder. Farmers, many of whom once supported protectionist policies, are now saying openly, "We were used." They feel like pawns in a big political game, and the ones who are losing are the ones who are least to blame. Reports from Iowa, Nebraska, and Wisconsin tell of people selling their equipment to pay off bank debts and leaving the profession that their families have been in for generations. In some regions, local banks are closing credit lines and agricultural cooperatives are announcing staff cuts. But even these figures do not convey the scale of the disaster. Behind every farmer is an entire ecosystem: transporters, mechanics, traders, processors. When goods are not exported, trucks, mills, and factories stand idle. In the Midwest, roads that used to be filled with endless columns of trailers loaded with grain and soybeans are now empty. At gas stations, drivers complain, "There are no orders, we've been standing here for weeks." In towns where agriculture was the main source of income, shops and cafes are closing. People are leaving in search of work, leaving behind empty streets and for sale signs.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
The situation is particularly difficult in regions where farming is not just a business but part of the identity. In Butler County, for example, where annual harvest fairs used to be held, the festival was cancelled this year for the first time in 73 years. The reason was that no one wanted to celebrate when nearly a third of farmers had declared bankruptcy. In a neighboring county, a rural school lost its funding because tax revenues from farms had fallen sharply. Teachers are retiring, young people are leaving, and it seems that life itself is receding along with the decline of trade. All this is just the outer side of the crisis. There is also a deeper, almost invisible crack. Farmers are losing not only their income, but also their sense of stability, their confidence that their labor is needed by someone. One agricultural expert said in an interview with Bloomberg that the current downturn could be a turning point for the American agricultural sector. If China does not resume purchases, it will be impossible to restore previous export volumes even in a decade. After all, China has already found new suppliers, which means that America has lost not just a customer, but a market that shaped an entire industry.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Against this backdrop, domestic problems are only getting worse. Fuel prices are rising and the weather is becoming increasingly unpredictable. Drought in the south and heavy rains in the center of the country have made this season one of the most difficult in the last 20 years. The combination of natural disasters and trade barriers has turned the agricultural year into a real disaster. Some farmers admit that they no longer see the point in planting their fields. The costs are not recouped, and there are no sales. The American press is publishing emotional articles with photos of empty grain silos and dairy farms where workers are quitting in droves. One TV channel even ran a story about a farmer from Illinois who left a note on his barn door. "I fought as hard as I could, but the world has changed." It later turned out that he had left to look for work in Texas. Such stories are becoming more and more common.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
The situation is exacerbated by rumors and speculation. There are reports in the media that China has not only refused American products, but has also specifically entered into long-term contracts with South America in order to oust the US from the world market. According to some estimates, up to 90% of previous soybean supplies have already been replaced by supplies from Brazil and Argentina. Moreover, new terminals and processing plants designed specifically for South American raw materials are being actively built in China. Even if the trade war ends tomorrow, it will be almost impossible to return to this market. When Washington decided to impose large-scale tariffs on China, the arguments sounded convincing. There was talk of protecting American industry, of the need to level the playing field, of fairness. But behind these slogans lay something more: political calculation and the belief that China would not be able to respond symmetrically. The reality turned out to be the opposite. Beijing not only responded in kind, but did so with surgical precision, striking at what was most sensitive for American agriculture. It was the farmers who supported the hardline policy who became the first victims of the confrontation. Economists warned that agricultural exports are not just commodities, but part of a complex geopolitical system where contracts, logistics, and trust have been built up over decades. When the chain is broken, it is almost impossible to restore it. China acted coolly. In the first weeks after the introduction of US tariffs on Chinese goods, the government in Beijing imposed tariffs of up to 100% on US agricultural products. Soybeans, corn, meat, and dairy products almost doubled in price on the Chinese market, which instantly made them uncompetitive. But unlike the temporary boycott, China did not limit itself to waiting. Within 3 months, intensive negotiations began with Brazil and Argentina, which offered not only to replace American supplies, but also to take on long-term commitments. Beijing promised loans, port construction, and agricultural machinery modernization, everything to speed up the transition.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
In Brazil, the expansion of the North-South Railway, connecting the soybean fields of Mato Grosso with the ports of Santos and Paranagua, began in record time. Chinese engineers who arrived in the country as part of a joint investment worked around the clock. New grain elevators appeared in Argentina, financed through preferential loans from the China Development Bank, while American farmers were trying to obtain government subsidies just to survive the season. South America was turning into the new breadbasket of the world. These steps were not spontaneous. According to research centers, even before the trade war began, Chinese analysts were developing a food autonomy scenario that envisaged a sharp reduction in dependence on the US. When the crisis broke out, the plans were simply taken out of the safes. Within a matter of months, dozens of contracts were signed, and soybean imports from Brazil increased by 80%. By 2025, the share of American products on the Chinese market had fallen to almost zero. Washington understood that it would be impossible to return to previous export volumes, but the scale of the shift was still shocking.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
The change in suppliers triggered a chain reaction. Australia expanded its exports of beef and milk, becoming a key player in the Asian region. New Zealand joined in supplying dry milk, while Vietnam and Thailand offered to supply feed and fruit. China used this moment not only to diversify its food sources, but also to create new trade alliances. As part of the Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing financed the construction of logistics hubs throughout South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, connecting them with a single transport network. This was not simply a matter of replacing one supplier with another. China was building a structure in which it itself would become the center of global agricultural logistics. The new contracts included not only supplies but also joint management, risk insurance, and product quality control. All this gave Beijing long-term influence over the supply chain from field to shelf. Unlike the US, where exports often depended on market fluctuations and political decisions, China was building a system designed to last for decades.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
At the same time, something was happening in Latin America that many in Washington preferred to ignore. Beijing was not just buying grain, it was investing in roads, energy projects, and telecommunications. New container terminals capable of handling ships with double the cargo capacity began to be built along the coasts of Brazil and Peru. In Bolivia, plans emerged to create grain hubs managed by Chinese companies. These facilities were partially controlled through equity participation, which effectively turned them into an extension of China's trade infrastructure. When China officially announced the completion of its transition to a multi-source food supply system in 2024, American analysts called it the United States' biggest strategic defeat since the oil crisis of the 1970s. The loss of the Chinese market meant more than just a decline in revenue. It destroyed the very model of American agricultural superiority. Supplies built up over decades of diplomacy were replaced by a network that the US could no longer enter. Fictitious but plausible estimates by some independent economists claimed that in the 3 years since the start of the trade war, about 15% of American farms had reduced production, and the industry's total losses exceeded $200 billion. The fall in grain prices led to mass bankruptcies among small processors and transport companies. All this became part of a larger process, the slow shift of the economic center of gravity from North America to the Southern Hemisphere.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Meanwhile, Brazil and Argentina have become new agricultural superpowers. With the support of Chinese investment, they not only increased crop yields, but also introduced precision farming technologies based on satellite monitoring and artificial intelligence. These developments, previously available only to American corporations, were now used in tandem with Chinese data processing systems. This gave rise to a new format of cooperation, where science and capital were united under the banner of geopolitical calculation. Washington tried to respond. Attempts were made to open new markets in India, Africa, and the Middle East, but these efforts yielded only partial results. None of the new buyers could replace China in terms of purchase volume and contract stability. Moreover, many of them were already participating in Chinese infrastructure initiative, which reduced their interest in American supplies.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
It gradually became clear that the trade war, which began as an attempt to assert American leadership, ended with China consolidating its own. Beijing's strategy worked not only economically but also symbolically. It showed that it was capable of reshaping the global trading system without the participation of the United States. This shift was not just a temporary phenomenon, but a new reality in which American farmers lost their status as indispensable suppliers and China became the conductor of global food flows. The world changed faster than anyone expected. And although there were still calls in American political circles to restore a fair balance, the balance itself had already shifted. Step by step, China used the crisis not as a threat, but as an opportunity. And now that new routes have been established, new alliances have been formed, and millions of tons of grain are coming not from American ports, but from South America, it is clear that the old order will not return.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
While global markets were restructuring to accommodate new trade realities, what many experts call a quiet shift was taking place in the United States itself. The loss of the Chinese market was no longer seen as a temporary phenomenon, it became a symbol of a deeper process. America, which had dictated the rules of global trade for decades, suddenly found itself an observer. Where until recently the US had dictated terms, decisions were now being made in Beijing, Brasilia, and Buenos Aires. The White House economic advisors discussed how to regain lost influence, but the real levers had already been lost. China did not simply find a replacement for American farmers, it built a network of states around itself, linked by common contracts, loans, and infrastructure projects. In Latin America, Chinese influence became evident not only in ports and grain elevators, but also in politics. More and more governments in the region openly declared their support for a multipolar world where the US was no longer the sole center of power. Chinese investment was seen not as a threat, but as an opportunity for development without external pressure. According to unofficial estimates, by 2025, Chinese investment in South American infrastructure exceeded $500 billion. And in some countries, dependence on Beijing reached a level comparable to American influence in the 1980s. China has become the continent's main partner in energy, mining, and agriculture. This was no longer just an economic union, it was a new world order in which Washington lost its monopoly on strategic decisions.